treat mental illness and physical illness very differently. When we would talk about his depression, people would say, what does he have to be depressed about? We heard all those platitudes too, like, has he prayed about it? Has he given it to God? Meanwhile, if somebody has diabetes, do we say that to them?
No.
Have you prayed about your diabetes? Have you prayed for God to take it away? The dichotomy was really unfathomable.
Erin Blechman, welcome to the Stop Faking Fine podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. And I love the name of your podcast.
Oh, geez. Yes. It's time for all of us to stop faking fine. I know that there are so many people that resonate with that. And I think each and every one of us at some moment in time have faked it. Everyone, like I have recognized over the years, like I often talk about my husband dying and my own journey of grief. But there are so many reasons to grieve, so many different things. And I have recognized over the years, and especially as my young boys turn into men, how the grief journey is just so different for each and every one of us. And in my heart, I'm always thinking about my mother-in-law as I am thinking about myself in the moments and my boys in the moments. I'm always thinking about her and how it's so different to grieve the loss of a child than it is to grieve the loss of a spouse. And even for my kids to grieve the loss of their dad. Like every little journey has such, I don't know, so many just different details and impacts on the way that your life moves forward. So I just really appreciate you opening your heart and being here to share your journey as a parent. Max committed suicide in June of 2020 after a long battle with mental illness. Like, can you share with us, what was Max like?
Well, he was the most interesting person I've ever known. And I don't just say that because I'm his mom. He really was. So he was just such a unique, quirky little guy right from the beginning. He started speaking in full sentences at 18 months, and he never stopped.
Amazing.
He read his first Harry Potter book between kindergarten and first grade. He was at 2. He had memorized all of the NFL teams, the name of the team and their city. So
wow.
He and my husband would have this little party trick where Bill would
at
say,
2?
At 2. He would say Buffalo and Max would say Bills. He'd say Pittsburgh and Max would say Steelers. So it was a great little trick. He was really intelligent, and it was obvious from a young age. And he was also incredibly sensitive. Yeah. And I think that sensitivity was just a precursor to his depression that really hit him hard when he went away to college. Okay. And even in high school, he struggled with depression and anxiety, although we didn't know that's what it was.
I was just going to say, were you aware at all, or is it only in your reflection now that you could see different moments from high school that you would notice that he was anxious or depressed? Like, can you share more about that?
Yeah, well, looking back, I mean, I can see signs from when he was even a little guy. You know, this is just one example, but we had a dog. We got a dog when Max was in 3rd grade and Sam was in 1st grade. She was a little Karen Terrier, and she was a feisty little bugger. Yeah. And we had an electric fence. She got out of the yard all the time. We live on about 1.5 acres in a very wooded area, but it's kind of in the middle of a suburban area. So there's lots of roads and lots of other neighborhoods around. And so anyway, Cookie was her name, and she would get loose quite often as a puppy. And we would go, scouring through the woods trying to find her. And Sam and I, my other son, we would be calling her name and, we would be concerned. But Max's level of concern and agitation was at a completely different level. He would go through every possible worst case scenario. Like, Mom, what if she's hit by a car? What if she gets eaten by another animal? What if she's in a fight with another dog? And so he just was very sensitive. And, looking back, I see that his reactions were kind of bigger and more intense than the rest of ours. And so I see signs of the anxiety and depression from the time he was a little boy, frankly. And it just got progressively worse. In high school, he was seeing a therapist. He had some pretty significant physical ailments that we thought were Crohn's. It ended up just being anxiety. And
isn't it crazy how many things come back to, I mean, the list of having high cortisol, which is what I'm always talking about, which is living in this state of panic, fight or flight, that there are so many side effects that we go chasing. So he didn't have Crohn's. He had, how did you understand that? How did you make that connection where you knew that he didn't have Crohn's?
Well, we had every test done to him. He had a colonoscopy in high school. He had a CT scan. He had an endoscopy. And, they kept saying, we're not finding any reason for his issues, for his gastrointestinal issues. So ultimately, he was just diagnosed with IBS. And he really struggled with that, from that point forward.
Was he on an anxiety medication?
So not until he went to college. So he went to college in the fall of 2013.
Okay.
And he only lasted 6 weeks. And it was the day before his birthday, he started to have thoughts of suicidal thoughts. So he called 911 on himself and he ended up at the hospital.
Oh, wow.
It was out of state. And so we went down and we ended up pulling him out of school and bringing him home. And that's when he started on some medication. And he was on a whole host of things. He was on mostly antidepressants. And then he had some sort of as needed anxiety medications. But the other thing that happened, so that was right before his 19th birthday. And then the following summer, right before his 20th birthday, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. He just started having seizures out of the blue. And so
out of the blue, or do you think that it was related to any of the medications that he was on?
Maybe, we don't know. But it was just all of a sudden he started to have this seizure disorder. And then he was on medications for seizures. And the thing about, and that's a good question, Dana, because the thing about many antidepressants is they do lower a person's seizure threshold. So there may have been some, correlation. That's the interesting thing. There is a correlation between epilepsy and depression. But there's no causation that they know of. So, but it was just a horrible blow, to his ego. He lost his license for several years and he felt like he lost his independence as a result. Yeah. So it was tough. It was tough.
That was at what age? At what age was it? 18 when he went to college and then came home and had the seizure and had his driver's license taken away?
Yeah, he went to college. He has a September birthday. His birthday's coming up at the end of the month. So he went to college at 18 and turned 19 like within a month. And that's when he was officially diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And then it was the following year, right before his 20th birthday. So he was 19 when he was diagnosed with epilepsy, but right around the same time frame. It was like 1 year it was the major depressive disorder, and then the next year it was the epilepsy.
Yeah. So, and that was in what year? And he passed away in June of 2020. So that was 1 year into him being home with you?
No. So he went to college in 2013. He was diagnosed with epilepsy in 2014. So that was like 6 years he really struggled. Yeah.
Mental illness doesn't have as much of a stigma as it used to, but I feel like even back in 2013, that really makes my heart hurt because in 2013, that's the year that my husband died. And I feel like I know even in that moment, the world was not talking about anxiety, depression, or any kind of mental illness issue. It was still brushed under the rug. And I feel like if I have the time frame correct, maybe 2019, 2020, we started to talk about it a little bit more, like after the pandemic and all of that. So probably even 2021, 2022, right? So what is your thought on how he managed that in those years when did he feel like he had to hide the fact that he was depressed or anxious?
So I think he felt different. I know he felt different. And I think that he kind of was in and out of our house during those years, mostly living on his own, though. He then, like I said, we pulled him out of college, out of state, and he went to a local school off and on, over those years, and then ultimately decided he didn't want to finish, but he was still kind of living mostly on his own in apartments, in houses with friends. And then when he had a crisis, he would come home. But I will say he surrounded himself. I used to say he was a wounded bird, so he surrounded himself with other wounded birds. So he kind of found people who understood him. But there was definitely, and I think there still is, there was definitely a stigma. Just as an example, when we were pretty upfront with our community and our family about what he was going through, both his mental illness and his epilepsy. And the response that we got from those two issues, it was completely different. So when we would talk about his depression, people would say, what does he have to be depressed about?
Yes. Doesn't that just make your hair stand up? Like it is so frustrating for me. And I can feel myself in the same journey. Like I walked out of the hospital after my husband died, and I openly share, like I literally walked into a life where I lived in fight or flight, anxious, overwhelmed. I didn't know what side was up. And to say that in 2013, a lot of times I was met with, well, you should give God your problem. Like you know that God has you. And I know that you've openly talked about how you went through a crisis of faith after he passed away. But I think that there are so many other, I know that there are so many other tools that we need to have in our tool belt, knowing like I'm a huge Jesus fan. I love God. I know that God has my life. He has a plan, but how you show up in those moments, that the feelings of anxiousness are real, and his feelings of depression are real. So how did you feel when your family came back with, well, what does he have to be depressed about? I mean, he's healthy. He's got this great family, all of the things.
Yeah. Well, I spent a lot of time being angry. I remember we had one friend who said at some point, and we heard all those platitudes too, like, has he prayed about it? Has he given it to God? Meanwhile, if somebody has diabetes, do we say that to them? Have you prayed about your diabetes? Have you prayed for God to take it away? No, we don't say that. So we just treat mental illness and physical illness very differently. But this one friend, we were talking about his depression, and just kind of off the hand, he said, I don't believe in depression. And my husband and I were so angry that we requested a one-on-one meeting with him to talk about the ignorance of that statement.
It's so ignorant. Did you walk away from that meeting with closure?
Yeah. It was just kind of a stupid comment, and he admitted that. And, he has family experience with mental illness. So but it was just that kind of thing over and over and over. And my point earlier was we were met with different reactions to his depression and his epilepsy. So that was kind of the response to his depression. What does he have to be depressed about? Has he prayed about it? Has he turned it over to God? And then his epilepsy, people would say, oh, gosh, that has to be so hard. I'm so sorry he lost his license. That had to be such a blow to his ego. Yeah. So the dichotomy was really unfathomable.
Because he was struggling with both things at the same level. Like the pain to him for both of those things was insurmountable.
Yes.
For you, what was the biggest challenge in supporting Max?
I would say it was sort of living on constant high alert. We got many crises calls. We got, he was hospitalized, 5 or 6 times for suicide ideation over those years. And every time his number would come up on my phone, my stomach would just drop. And so it was just living with that constant worry, and that constant fear of what could happen, what might happen. We were afraid, obviously, of what ultimately happened, that he was going to hurt himself purposefully. But then we were also concerned that he was going to hurt himself accidentally, having a seizure. Like
Yeah.
one time he had a seizure when he was walking across his college campus.
Oh
And
gosh.
and he had they used to be called the grand mal seizures. So, on the ground, oftentimes losing control of his bladder. It was just, they were horrific. It honestly is the worst thing I've ever seen. The most traumatic thing I've ever witnessed was him having a seizure. And, just imagine having that on a college campus in front of your peers and
Yeah.
being labeled that kid, that guy. It was just terrible. And,
Did he have friends in college that he would go to class with, or someone, like, what would happen in those moments? Was there someone close to him, always with him, that would then take care or know, or he was just left to whoever was passing by, the Good Samaritan?
Yep. 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 It was just, we ultimately got him a dog in 2016. She's not a service dog, but and we have her now. Her name is Emmy Lou, and she is my love. But we got her for him in September of 2016, and she was kind of like a therapy dog of sorts for him. She not only provided him emotional support, but she really is the most intuitive dog. So if he was struggling, she would be right there with him. She's like that with us now. If I'm talking and she hears my voice catch, she comes right over and puts her head on my thigh. She's just a very intuitive, loving dog.
Oh my gosh, that makes my heart smile so big for that moment.
Yeah.
You wrote a book about his death, My Unexpected Journey. How did writing this book help you process the grief and the complex emotions following Max's death?
Well, you might have thought that I would be somewhat prepared, somewhat expect what happened, because he struggled for so long and we lived in fear of what could happen. But as long as he was alive, I just had hope that he was going to be healed. I really felt like he was going to find the right balance of medication and lifestyle choices that was going to allow him to lead a productive life. I was convinced of that. I really felt like the Lord told me that he was going to be okay. And so when he died, I was completely blindsided and overwhelmed. And so he died in June of 2020. It was right in the thick of COVID. It was just an awful time. Everybody remembers what, the pandemic and the isolation and the quarantine.
Awful.
Yeah, just awful. And so that summer, I was depressed. I had a hard time getting out of bed. I didn't have motivation to really do anything. And I was seeing a therapist that I had been seeing prior to losing Max. And so she encouraged me to journal. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And then I started putting some of those journal entries out on social media. And it was not from a place, it wasn't from a good motivation. It was because I was tired of going to the grocery store and people either seeing me and walking the other direction.
Yeah. Oh, let's talk about that for a hot minute, because that is real.
Yes.
And I actually did a podcast, I think it was episode 38. I will link it in the show notes, about how you tell a story or even interact with people that have sad stories to share. Like, what do you say? Because watching people making eye contact with someone and watching them walk away, it was often me walking away. I was like, oh no, Erin, like I don't have time, like, to deal with in my own grief. Like, I don't have time for you to be like, how are you? I'm going to reply with, I'm fine. I'm totally not fine, but I don't want to dive deep into the conversation. So learning that skill was huge. So how did you react emotionally in your heart when people would see you in the grocery store and walk away?
Well, I would get really angry. So they would either walk away or they would come up to me with a stricken look on their face and say, how are you? And by the end of the conversation, I was comforting them.
Oh my gosh, yes. I have talked about this so many times on this podcast. Like, people would come to my house and bring meals right after my husband died and be so proud of themselves. And I'm so grateful. I'm not ungrateful for the meal. I'm so grateful to have friends and community and all the things, but bring a meal and then sit in my kitchen and start crying. And I'm like, how is this helpful? Like, did you bring wine? Like, where's the wine that's going with this meal? Like, if you're gonna start crying, then I need a cocktail. Like, it is so hard. And I know this podcast was birthed out of me faking fine, because then I became the person that didn't want to interact because I was basically afraid of the conversation that we were going to have. So your anger, my heart resonates with that. Like, I was so angry, and I feel like that is the best way to put it. So how did you deal with that?
Well, so instead of, I do think that those are the two approaches. When we get angry, I think we either isolate, we pull back and withdraw, or we become more bold. And I became more bold. So I started putting these journal entries out on social media, and they were raw. Yeah. They were honest. They were hard to read. And I got such positive feedback. I think because it was COVID, I think because everybody was struggling in one way, shape, or form, that they resonated with people's hearts. And so it was out of that. I think at some point somebody said in like a comment on one of my posts, you should write a book. And I thought, maybe I will. And then I found
Here we are.
Well, I found a woman at my church who's a graphic designer and an illustrator. And I contacted her and we started to talk. And I mean, it just evolved. The book just evolved. It's not like I sat down at any point and said, okay, I want to process my feelings through writing, and then I'm going to turn that into a book. It just happens. It was a God thing. It really was a God thing.
Yeah.
And so
I am so proud of you for the fact that you were able to journal in that moment. Like, I went to grief counseling and got the same advice, like, Dana, you should start journaling. And I was like, are you kidding me? I can't even like get my 3 kids from where they're going and do what I'm doing. Like, I don't have the bandwidth to sit down. And it's not until now for me, 11 years later, that I'm like, okay, let's process these thoughts. Let's get this together. When you met the graphic designer at church, like, can you share more about the birds? So this book is full of beautiful bird illustrations, and oh my gosh, lean in. I will link the book in the show notes below, but can you tell us more about the birds?
Yeah. So in the days and weeks following Max's death, I kept seeing the same bird over and over. Starting, it was either the day he passed or the next day. I don't know what kind of bird it was. I'm not a bird nerd, so I don't know my birds, but it was so obvious that this bird was a sign. And that's really common for people to see birds. A lot of times it's a cardinal, I think, because they're really recognizable. Sometimes it's a butterfly, sometimes it's a dragonfly. But anyway, I kept seeing the same bird over and over. And given the fact that I even noticed it in my state, it was pretty amazing. And so when Sarah Nelson is my graphic designer and illustrator, when I started to share some of those early writings with her, she grabbed a hold of that and she said, let's make the bird our theme. And so she did 6 original illustrations of a bird that appear throughout my book. Sometimes,
and they're so great. They just capture you. She did such a beautiful job with mixing this bird in with Max's story and with your journey. It's just a beautiful illustration of something that's really terrible. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing about my book, I mean, it's essentially a coffee table book, when it's in print version, because there's color on every page. It's full of illustrations. It's full of family photos that she displays as these beautiful full page spreads, like scrapbook pages. It's just the way she laid it out is just so beautiful. And that summer, and even into that fall after Max died, I read everything I could get my hands on because I felt so awful. I was convinced that there was something wrong with me. So I was just looking for, other perspectives. I was looking for, other people's stories. And so I read some good books. Some of them weren't helpful, but some of them were. But one of the things is when you read somebody's grief story, it's so heavy that it can leave you feeling just down and
Yeah.
melancholy. And I mean, you already feel that way anyway.
Yeah.
But, as Sarah and I were talking about the book before it became a reality, I kept saying I want it to have some visual appeal. I want there to be some balance to the heaviness of the content. And I feel like she did a beautiful job of that.
She did a beautiful job with that. And I think it's really important to point out that the subject of grief is heavy. And I think in my own experience, it's why I ran from the conversations for years and years and years and years, because when you ask me, Erin, and you don't know me and you see me at a basketball game and you're like, so Dana, where's your husband? Like, what does he do? And then I reply to you, well, he died. And I'm positive it's the same for you when people say, well, how many kids do you have? And you're like, I have 2. And they're like, well, where's the other one? And then you have to share, well, he passed away. And the look in the eyes of the other person tells the story, because they're like, oh, snap. I just dropped into a hole that I don't know how to get out of. And I think it's so important to provide helpful tools for not only those grieving, because I read the same number of books that you read, and most of them maybe comforted me a little bit, but also made me feel worse on other regards, because there's no answer in that book. You're just understanding that someone else had a terrible tragedy as well. But giving people help in this situation. So what advice do you have for the person that you run into in the grocery store that doesn't really know your story, and they say, oh, how many kids do you have? And you say 2, and they say, okay, well, tell me about them. And you share your story. Like, what would be helpful in your perspective for that person to share back with you?
That's a really good question. And I just feel like as a society, we have such a long way to go. Just a couple of weeks ago, a friend sent me a video of a roundtable discussion. It was actually from a seminary, and it was a group of diverse people talking about grief. And one of the native English speaking people said, the phrase that we use is, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I've said that. We've heard that 1,000 times since Max died. But when you think about that phrase, it kind of puts a barrier between the person saying it and the person receiving it. Like, I'm sorry for your loss. Like, I'm over here, you're over there. I don't want to come over there.
Yeah.
And you can't come over here because you're in this grief. But during this video, one of the Spanish speaking people said that the English translation of the common phrase in Spanish is, I accompany you in your sorrow.
Oh, and that's a whole lot closer.
It's so beautiful. So beautiful. First of all, there's no barrier. It's building a bridge. It's saying, I accompany you. And that's what we need when we're grieving. Yeah. We need people to accompany us. We don't need them to feel sorry for us.
No. And I think that, like, the feeling sorry for, I applaud you so much for journaling and getting this book out. And it's not been that many years. And you're like, I am going to turn this around and make something good out of something terrible. And I'm going to do it quickly. And rather than stuffing your feelings and faking fine, because you need the tools in order to show up and actually, like, grow through that and help. One of the things that Katie had shared in the episode that we talked about how to share your sad story is, if someone says, I'm so sorry for your loss. Like, I'm so sorry for your loss. Tell me about Max. Like, tell me, like after you share that, if that's the first thing that flies off your tongue, fine. But then lean in after that to say, tell me something about him, or something that makes it a little bit less awkward. And I mean, something as simple as, like, I say this often, like, you've got to tell your face what you're thinking. Like, what you're thinking is coming out on your face, and we can see the shock in other people's faces when you say, oh, well, he died. Yeah. And I think if you say, and it's all about, like, your boldness in the way that you say it, and you'll have to tell me what you think. But I think if you even shared like, well, he committed suicide, that would bring it to another level of shock for people. So when people ask you about Max, what is your answer? Like, how do you share that?
Yeah, that's good. And that has really evolved over the 4 years since he's been gone. And so we were upfront about the way he died right from the beginning. We put it in his obituary. So it was out there. It was out there in the world. And so a lot of people knew before they even saw us, at least people that were connected to us. You know, since then, the people who, you meet at the dinner party or you meet at, the new church or whatever. I do talk about Max very openly. I think a lot of times people take their cues from me. Like I'm involved in a Bible study, and I remember a couple of years ago I was introducing myself, and that was one of the things, like, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live, how many kids you have, if you're married. And so I said, I have 2 boys, Max and Sam. I said, Max is in heaven and, Sam is here in Pittsburgh. And, I just kind of said it very matter of factly. And then, as I get to know people a little bit better, I will share that he died by suicide. And that's the terminology we like to use is Max died by suicide rather than committed suicide, because the word committed has negative connotations. It's typically used to describe immoral or illegal behavior, committed a crime, committed adultery, committed a robbery. And so we will say he died by suicide after a long battle with mental illness. And my purpose now is to elevate the conversation about those topics. The meaning in my life now is to talk openly about mental illness so that to create greater awareness, talk openly about suicide to reduce the stigma, and to talk openly about loss and grief because we simply don't do enough of it in our culture, and everyone will experience a loss. So, there's really no one answer. And you know what, in all honesty, Dana, sometimes if I'm just not in the mood, I'll just say I have 2 kids and that.
Not every moment needs to be the moment, or not everyone needs to be invited into your heart to that level.
Nope.
But I think it's one huge step in the right direction to be bold enough to say, this is what happened. And for me, I would say that back in 2013, when my husband first died, I would say, okay, he died. And then I would very quickly just run away because I was like, I don't have time for the follow-up questions. And it's not even, I don't have time. I didn't have the mental bandwidth, which is completely changed since I've learned how to get out of fight or flight and learned, I've nerded out on nutrition and gut health and serotonin and dopamine and all of these things for my journey of grief. For your journey of grief, can you give if there's someone listening and they have a child that's struggling with a mental illness, like what is one thing that you would share with them? What's one tip that you can provide?
I don't know if I could reduce it to just one. I think the first, mental illness is not a behavioral problem, but often it presents itself in behavioral ways. So it's hard. It's hard to understand. It's hard to wrap your mind around. And I remember one of Max's therapists told us the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's motivation.
Yeah.
And so
it's not happy or not happy. That's not what it is.
Yeah.
Because when you're depressed, you mentioned it even like after he passed away. And I certainly experienced this, like laying in bed and I don't want to get out. And I was super thankful that I had 3 small children that had school that started at 8:00. And it was my sole responsibility to get them there. Otherwise I would have for sure laid in bed and been like, what's the point? Like that's depression. Lack of motivation is the best way. I like that. That's the best way to explain that.
Yeah. And just understanding that, depression is a disease like any other, just like I mentioned earlier, diabetes or heart disease. And I think if somebody has a child who's struggling with a mental illness, it's important to understand that it is a disease. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but I think it's also really important that you share it's not depression. Like for me, and even with the kids in my house, right? I have 3 children that we've all had to manage growing through grief after my husband died. And it comes out in lack of patience. It comes out in, anger. It comes out in lack of motivation. It comes out in so many different ways, and understanding that, and you just said this, the problem is not often the problem. Like the problem is not that, the problem is anxiety, and what you're seeing outward facing is that you're laying in bed and you're unmotivated.
Yeah.
And connecting those dots and then figuring out how to move forward. And the way that you have moved forward is very different than, well, not very, but like I nerded out on internal nutrition and how can I feel better by healing my gut, and learning that leaky gut is at the crux of so many of these problems.
Yeah.
And just really trying to support each and every one of us from the inside out so that you can lead into your faith, lean into all of these other things. In your book, you talk about, and I mentioned this a little bit before, your crisis of faith. Can you share more about how your faith has evolved over the years?
Yeah. So I have been a Jesus follower for a long time. And over the years that Max was sick and struggling, my faith remained very steadfast and strong. I prayed for him every day. We had prayer gatherings at our home to pray for him.
Mm-hmm.
I remember anointing his room with oil at one point. And then I think sort of the culmination was I remember walking through my neighborhood and praying as I was walking and hearing the Lord say, he's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. So I thought that meant he was going to be okay here on this earth. Mm-hmm. And I really clung to that. And then when he died, I thought, this is not the way this story's supposed to go.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I had the rug pulled out from under me. And so, at first I was, I still went through the motions. I still went to church. I still continued with some Bible study. My prayer life fell off, but other people were praying for us. So anyway, and then kind of as that shock and numbness wore off, I just became so angry. And then that anger at the Lord turned into apathy. And I was kind of like, I don't know if I can trust him, and I don't know if I want to trust him. And so it's been years, frankly, Dana, it's been years. And so, at the end of my book chronicles the 18 months following Max's death. And I remember my designer said, we need to pick an end date, because we kind of worked together probably from about the 6 month on. And she said, we need to figure out like what the end date is going to be. And so she suggested 12 months. And at 12 months, I was in such a deep, dark place. I was like, this would be the worst book ever if we edited it here.
Yeah. You're like, I have growing to do.
Yes. So then we ultimately ended at 18 months, because at 18 months, I could see light at the end of the tunnel. And the book is broken down by time frames. And so the last section, I can't remember the exact months, but it was the title of it was Hoping for Hope. I didn't have my hope back, but I could see that maybe I was going to get it back.
What made you see that you were maybe going to get it back?
They were just little things. I saw like in the rearview mirror, I saw some God moments that I didn't recognize at the time, that I either didn't want to recognize, or I was too angry to recognize, or too apathetic. And so it was, towards the end of that 18 months that I thought, he's been here all along. And I would have, have these situations where I felt like he was pulling me closer. And so, but, even after that 18-month mark, I wouldn't say that, everything was completely restored. But over the course of these 4 years, I'm still on my way back, but I'm much, much, much closer than I was even at that 18-month mark. So.
Well, I've podcasted about this with one of the pastors from my church who lost a child.
Yeah.
And understanding that anger phase is legit, and we all go through it. I mean, he talked about how he moved through his grief, and I can't think of the episode number right now, but I'll drop it in the show notes. he talked about his grief and how he was frustrated with God. And then his second daughter, who was 2 years younger, got diagnosed with the exact same problem that his daughter that had just died with it. And that's a whole different tragedy. But for me, I was very angry, like right out of the gate. Had done a lot of the same things that you did with Max, like had pastors anointing Jason with oil in the church, had all of the deacons praying over him, had doing all of the things that I knew to do, and praying over him myself, praying with my heart, having, believing. I never believed that he was going to die. We were in the hospital for 6 weeks and never once, like you never believed that Max was going to die. You believed that he was going to be healed from these thoughts and this illness and life would be fabulous. And I think we each go through this anger phase. And I think the first thing to, like, if you're listening, to lean into is that it's normal. Like it's normal to feel let down, really. And it took me 5 years of grieving and finally getting myself out of the state of anxiousness and overwhelm to realize that, okay, maybe his prayer was answered. And that's a hard pill to swallow because he would way have preferred to have been healed and be here. But growing through that grief, that, at 12 months, you are probably still very angry. And at 18 months, I love that you could see the hope for hope. Like that's such a beautiful way. It's just such a beautiful way to put it. So you have become an educated or certified grief counselor now. So can you share, what have you seen have the most impact, helpful wise, on grieving families?
So I think one of the biggest factors in our healing was joining a support group. Yeah. So we, Bill and I, we each had a therapist prior to losing Max that we continued with. We had a marriage counselor that we were seeing, because having a child who struggled with health issues for 8 years was hard. It was hard on our marriage. It was hard on our relationship. And so we had a marriage therapist. So we continued with those things after losing Max. I'm a big gardener. And so we installed a garden on our property, a Max Memorial Garden. We did all sorts of things.
Yeah. But gardening is also very therapeutic and very good for your cortisol hormone and your own internal inflammation. Putting your hands in the dirt, that is getting such hype right now, and it's scientifically proven. So that's your own grief therapy, is getting in the garden. And not only that it's a garden for Max or in Max's name. So I'm sure that you have a lot of meditative time while you're out there thinking and healing, but getting in the garden is so good for your own stress resilience.
Yeah, it was just, and it was also something productive to do with my grief, So, but then at that year mark, I honestly felt so bad at that 12-month mark at the year anniversary that I really thought, like, maybe I just need to go to like some kind of institution. I'm not good for regular society. I felt so awful because everybody expects to feel bad for a year. But then I think, that's kind of societal message is after a year, you should be
fine. You should totally be fine. And you're over it. Yeah. And that is the farthest thing from the truth. You are never it has taken me years and years and years, which I know you're in the same place, but you never get over the grief. And I think the analogy of like a grief being a rock in your pocket, and the rock doesn't get any smaller. You're going to carry that rock now for the rest of your life, but you build muscles and get stronger, and the grief gets a little bit lighter in a sense, but it's still always going to be there.
Always. Yeah. Well, at that 12-month mark, we found a grief group. It was a suicide survivor support group that was meeting online. The way that whole thing transpired was another God moment. But anyway, we started to attend this online support group, and it was a total game changer. because there were other people who had survived the same type of loss. We could say anything to this group of people and we would see the heads nodding. So we felt like, I would say,
you felt seen and heard. Like,
exactly. And I would say at the 12-month mark, the feeling I had most was I just felt so alone. I felt like nobody understood. Nobody else was going through what I was going through.
Yeah.
We had a wonderful support system, wonderful family and friends, but none of them had lost a child. And so it wasn't until we joined a group of people that understood that I think we really started to heal.
Yeah.
And looking back, it was all those things. But
right. It's a combination of all of them for sure, but it's picking out. And I think really it's helpful to talk about what were the things, like what were all of the things that come together to help you grow through the grief. I had joined a grief support group here. And for me, it wasn't helpful because I was the youngest one there and everyone else was in their 60s, 70s. And while our grief was similar, it wasn't enough of the same for me to feel seen. I was 40 and I had 3 young kids at home. I was like, this is great, but not really great. And I think you mentioned for a second, and I would love to talk about this more because I'm sure that this is a huge thing, is the stress on your marriage for 8 years trying to support Max. So if there's someone else in that position, what is the best advice that you have for them outside of, counseling?
Well, I think communication and counseling. Counseling, I think, is so critical. Our marriage therapist has been wonderful, and we still continue to see him periodically, even today, because he just helps us when we're at an impasse. So that was the thing when Max was sick. Sometimes, I went off the rails and Bill was there to kind of bring me back. And sometimes he would go off the rails and I was there to bring him back. But then sometimes we both went off the rails at the same time. And there was nobody to pull us back. And so, learning tools to, communicate and come together and just to not judge each other. That's been important both when Max was sick and since he passed, is don't judge each other for the way that we're handling the situation.
That is so rich. Like the judgment piece.
Oh my gosh. It's so easy.
It's so easy. It is so easy. I think for anyone grieving anything, we have all felt judged for something, for, doing it right, doing it wrong, not doing it the way you thought that we should do it. And so having that empathy and that grace to not judge is so, so, so important. Yeah. One more question that I have for you is, what have you learned about the grief that is most comforting for you? And maybe it's Max's garden, when the waves of grief, when the tsunami is coming to take you down, what tools do you rely on to help you grow through that?
I think for me, and my therapist has pointed this out, I am an active griever. So I tend to do something with my grief. So when
you're posting it on Facebook, it's going up. Here's what I think. I'm going to put it up there and I'm going to let everybody else see it, which I totally love your boldness in that area. And I love how you say that you're an active griever. Like, that's such a priceless way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I feel the wave and I cry, but a lot of times it's helpful to go out and go for a walk. It's helpful to go out in the garden. On just this past June, on the anniversary of Max's death, my husband and I went to a field and released paper lanterns. Yeah. So just doing something, it feels productive. It feels helpful. It feels healing. And so, but not everybody's like that. And
no, but I think it's helpful to share tips and tools. And this is kind of, taking us side street to this conversation. But even like for Max's birthday, like what do you do? How do you celebrate that in your home now?
So we haven't actually decided how we're going to celebrate it this year. But the first year, we sat down. So it was me and Bill and Sam, our other son, and we watched home videos.
Yeah.
And but there's a lot of people who can't look at pictures and can't look at videos for a long time.
But that was therapeutic for you, wasn't it?
It was so therapeutic. I mean, we have some of the cutest, quirkiest videos of him, and it was just beautiful memories, beautiful things to remember. So, that was the first year. Then the second year, our son Sam decided he was going to do a run for Max.
Okay.
And so he ran, or maybe it was that. Anyway, and Sam has done this twice now. And he does a run for Max, and he runs the number of miles in honor of what would have been Max's birthday. So the first year it was 26 miles. And then, last year it was...
Ooh, that's going to get harder and harder as time goes by.
I know. So this year he's doing it the weekend after Max's birthday, and he's going to run 30 miles because Max would be 30 this year. Mm-hmm. And so that's a family affair. Sam does the running, and then, we get involved in the fundraising. We get involved in the gathering afterwards, the picnic pavilion with the food and the friends and the family, and make the signs and do the whole 9 yards. And, he's done it twice now. And both times he's raised over $20,000 for American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
That is amazing. Totally. I was just going to ask what foundation you were supporting. So can you share more about why you like that particular foundation?
Well, so they are the leading researcher in figuring out suicide prevention. Mm-hmm. So they just have wonderful programs. They're all about reducing the stigma, talking openly about it, they have a program, I think it's called Talk Saves Lives. So they're all about elevating the conversation. And that's very much my heart as well, is the more we talk about suicide, the more people understand it, the greater we reduce the stigma. Mm-hmm. And, there's people want simple answers to complex questions. Mm-hmm. And the reasons a person takes his or her life are vast and very, very diverse. And so there's no one simple answer. And as we talk openly about suicide, we put faces to it, and people realize that.
Yeah. And I think we're talking, like on this podcast, I talk tools, tips, and strategies for everything related to stress resilience, and related to helping you show up for yourself, your family, your world better. And having, like you just mentioned, there's not one answer that's going to solve a depression issue or a suicidal ideations, but it's a combination of tools. Yes. And adding more tools to your tool belt to say, okay, I've got one more thing that I can do that's going to bring my mental state into a better place is super helpful. So how do we get the book? I'll put the book in the show notes below. Can you tell us just a little bit more? Like the book is called Your Unexpected Journey. It's 18 months of your journal entry. And I don't know, like what's one closing thought you would like to share about the book?
Can I have two closing thoughts?
Yeah, please do.
So the book is called My Unexpected Journey, and the subtitle is Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide. Yeah. And it's available on Amazon. Currently, that's the only distributor. It's a paperback, and it just came out as a Kindle. And so I'm really proud that I'll be able to reach people who read ebooks, because that's all I read. I only read ebooks. So it makes sense that it would now be available in that form. And the interesting thing about the book that I have found since it came out is that it resonates with people certainly who have lost someone to suicide.
Yeah.
It also resonates with people who have lost a child. Yeah. It resonates for parents who have a child who is struggling with a mental illness and fear their death. And it also resonates with just, pastors, therapists, people who just lay people who are walking alongside those that are grieving and just want to understand, want a glimpse into that world in a better way. And so that has been surprising for me, that my book kind of hits people where they are, but it's very gratifying to know.
Yes. But especially if you're walking alongside someone that's grieving, it's not an easy path to take. And we need, like, you need tools. Again, you need tools and strategies, and using this book as a resource for that. As a certified grief educator, what is one thing that you would share with someone that wants to move forward, but doesn't know how? Like, read the books, read the stories, and feel like you're not alone. But what else would you share with them to help in moving forward?
Yeah. So in the back of the book, the original version had like kind of tips that I've learned. And it was things like, therapy, marriage counseling. I had to take medication for a period of time just to be able to function. The creative outlets like the journaling, like the gardening, setting realistic expectations. I really thought I would feel better in a year. And so I sort of set that arbitrary deadline. And when that deadline came,
you tried to hold yourself accountable to it. And you really going back to that time frame, like, we really have no clue, but we're grasping at straws, and we're like, okay, if I can make it a year. I did that year after year after year after year. I was like, okay, if I can make it a year, I'm going to have closure. Okay, I guess it's 2 years. And then you start to feel defeated because you're like, why don't I feel better at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? And it's not until I was able to switch the lens of, these are just tools, and I'm doing better this year than I was doing last year. Every year you're growing and learning and listening to podcasts like this one that are giving you tools and strategies to help, and helping yourself, holding yourself accountable to grow.
Yeah.
Right?
That's great. Yep, that's so
rather
true.
than staying stuck. Oh my gosh, Erin, I could talk to you for the next 5 hours. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I will drop the links to everything in the show notes. Make sure you get the book. Make sure you share this with a friend. And until next time, sweet friend, thank you so much for sharing your heart, for journaling your heart, for the rest of us to read and listen to. And I'm glad that you are an active griever that was showing up on Facebook with all of the things. Yes, we appreciate you.
Oh, Dana, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to join you today. And I just hope that, somebody who's listening feels a little bit of comfort and clarity. So
feel seen and heard. And that's really the first step for all of us in growing through the many facets of grief, is to feel like you're not alone.
Yep.
And we're here giving you a big old virtual hug, telling you that you are not alone, and that, we're here to help.
Yep.
All right, girlfriend, until next time.
Thank you so much.